Welcome to History Teller YT. Today, we embark on a journey through one of humanity's darkest and most defining chapters, the Transatlantic Slave Trade. This is not just a story of ships and empires, but of stolen lives, broken families, resistance, survival, and the birth of cultures that shape our world today. Over centuries, millions of men, women, and children were taken from Africa, chained in the horrors of the Middle Passage, and forced into brutal labor across the Americas. Yet even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, they resisted. They sang, they prayed, they fought, and they dreamed of freedom. This 20-part series will take you from the origins of slavery to the rebellions, from the rise of abolition to the echoes we still feel in racism and inequality today. By the end, you will not only know the history, you will feel its weight, its scars, and its lessons. Stay with us, because this is a story the world must never forget. Long before the ships of Europe reached the shores of Africa, slavery existed, but it looked profoundly different from what would later come to define the Atlantic world. In ancient civilizations such as Egypt, Rome, and Greece, slavery was not primarily based on race. People became slaves through conquest, debt, or punishment. A slave could be a Greek captured by Romans, a defeated soldier in Mesopotamia, or even a local citizen who had fallen into debt. Though brutal, slavery was often not permanent, and many enslaved people could eventually gain freedom or even attain positions of influence. In Africa, slavery also existed. Captives from intertribal wars or criminals were sometimes enslaved, but the system was not dehumanizing in the same way as the racialized chattel slavery that would soon emerge. Everything changed in the 15th century when European powers, particularly Portugal and later Spain, began exploring the African coasts. What started as trade in gold, ivory, and spices gradually shifted toward human cargo. This transformation did not occur overnight. It was a slow, deliberate corruption of older systems. European demand for labor in newly colonized lands across the Atlantic grew insatiable, particularly after the decimation of indigenous populations in the Americas due to disease and warfare. The solution? An industrialized, race-based system of slavery that commodified African bodies as property, permanent, inheritable, and justified through emerging ideologies of white supremacy. This shift marked the beginning of one of the most horrifying and sustained systems of human exploitation in history. It birthed the modern concept of race as justification for exploitation, and this ideology would echo for centuries, deeply embedding itself in Western institutions. The stage was set not only for mass human trafficking across oceans, but for a total redefinition of human worth. In the mid-15th century, Portuguese explorers, under the sponsorship of Prince Henry the Navigator, began venturing along the West African coast. Their original aim was trade, gold, spices, and establishing routes to India. But what they found instead was an opportunity that would reshape history. In 1444, a Portuguese fleet captured hundreds of Africans and brought them to Lagos, Portugal, selling them in Europe. This marked one of the earliest recorded sales of enslaved Africans to Europeans and the beginning of a chilling trend. As Portuguese involvement deepened, they set up fortified trading posts along the African coastline, places like Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana. These factories, a bitterly ironic term, weren't industrial plants. They were human warehouses. Africans were traded like barrels of oil, exchanged for guns, cloth, or alcohol. Spanish colonizers, observing Portugal's wealth, quickly joined in. When Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492, Spain's need for labor to mine gold and farm sugar exploded. Initially, they enslaved the indigenous people of the Caribbean and Central America. but disease and brutal treatment caused indigenous populations to collapse. A new source of labor was required, one considered stronger, more resilient. The European gaze turned fully toward Africa. The Church sanctioned it. In 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued the Dum Diversas and later Romanus Pontifex, authorizing Christian rulers to enslave non-Christians. These papal bulls gave divine cover to what was fast becoming a transcontinental business model. Human lives became merchandise. From being honored elders and farmers in their own communities, Africans were reduced to entries in ledgers. And so began the centuries-long flood of humanity across the Atlantic. Millions stripped of name, language, and dignity. Though Europeans drove demand, the supply of human beings for the slave trade was made possible by African intermediaries, coastal kings, merchants, and warlords. Contrary to simplistic narratives, the transatlantic slave trade was not just a story of external invasion. It was also one of tragic collaboration. African polities like the Kingdom of Dahomey, a Shawnee empire, and parts of the Yoruba and Congo kingdoms became heavily involved in the capture and sale of their fellow Africans, incentivized by European weapons, goods, and wealth. Warfare changed. Previously, African conflicts often ended in negotiations or symbolic victories. But with the European demand for captives, wars became more brutal and more frequent. Captives weren't just spoils, they were currency. Raids into the interior captured thousands, often with no regard for kinship, tribe, or innocence. Those taken were marched in chains to coastal forts, branded, and held in dark dungeons beneath trading posts. Here, in these cramped stone cells, often less than 5 feet high and filled with human waste, men, women, and children waited shipment. Some waited weeks, others waited months. All waited for the dreaded ships that would take them into the unknown. It's important to recognize this cooperation not as proof of African culpability alone, but as evidence of how colonial greed corrupted pre-existing structures. European merchants manipulated local politics, fueled rivalries, and armed warlords. Some African leaders resisted. The Congolese king Nzinga Mbemba, Afonso I, for example, begged the Portuguese king to stop the trade, condemning the corruption and destruction it brought. His pleas were ignored. The profits were too great, the system too deeply rooted. And so, as the 16th century turned, the Atlantic began to echo with sorrow. Ships filled with human cargo departed Africa's shores regularly, destined for plantations across Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. The Middle Passage, the heart of horror, awaited. Imagine a ship, not the kind that carries treasure, explorers, or spices, but one designed solely to transport suffering. The slave ship was no ordinary vessel. It was a machine of misery, a floating prison engineered to maximize human cargo at the expense of humanity itself. Once captured Africans were marched to coastal forts and sold. They were herded onto these ships in chains, often naked, branded, and stripped of identity. Men, women, and children were forced below deck, into spaces so tight that they could not sit upright, sometimes lying shoulder to shoulder, head to foot like cargo crates. There was no room to move, no privacy, no escape. The smell was unbearable. Vomit, urine, feces, blood, all mixed into a choking stench that soaked the wooden planks and lingered for months. Some slave ships carried up to 500 people in spaces meant for half that number. To the captains and traders, these souls were numbers, units of profit. Every inch of space was measured to fit another body. Breathing was difficult. Fresh air was a luxury, often available only through tiny grates above deck. In stormy weather or times of unrest, these grates were shut tight, trapping people in near total darkness. where oxygen ran low and panic surged. The enslaved were shackled together, sometimes by the neck, always by the ankles or wrists. Chains clinked constantly. Speaking was discouraged. Singing, unless encouraged for exercise, was forbidden. Guards with whips patrolled the decks. Women were vulnerable to sexual assault. Children were torn from their parents. Every sound, the groaning of wood, the crashing waves, the screams, formed a symphony of sorrow. And yet, this was only the beginning of the journey. The Middle Passage had no mercy, and it spared no dignity. The horrors of the Middle Passage were not limited to confinement. The slave ships were floating graveyards. Disease was a constant killer. Dysentery, known as the bloody flux, swept through the holds, claiming lives within days. Smallpox, measles, and fever spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. There were no doctors, no medicine, and no mercy. Bodies rotted where they lay. Sometimes dead were left among the living for days before being tossed overboard. Every morning, the crew would unlock the shackles and order the enslaved above deck for exercise, more of a ritual to keep them barely alive than any act of compassion. Those too weak to stand were whipped. Some were prodded with hot irons. Others were forced to dance to the rhythm of European instruments, not for joy, but to prevent their muscles from wasting away before sail. The crew fed them just enough to survive, mostly beans, rice, or flour mashed with water. Water was stale or full of algae. Hunger gnawed constantly, but many lost the will to eat at all. Mothers gave birth in chains. Newborns often died within hours. The cries of children mixed with the moans of the sick and the shouting of overseers. At night, the ship creaked under the weight of sorrow. Even the waves seemed to weep. On average, 15 to 20% of enslaved people died during the Middle Passage. On some voyages, that number reached 50%. And when disease spread uncontrollably, captains made cruel choices, throwing the sick overboard to protect the rest of the cargo or to claim insurance. Yes, insurance. Under maritime law, slavers could be compensated for lost property if human cargo was jettisoned due to threat or damage. The Atlantic Ocean became a grave. Beneath its blue surface lie the bones of millions whose names we'll never know. A watery cemetery stretched across continents. And yet, even in this endless sea of despair, there flickered glimmers of defiance. Despite the overwhelming suffering, many refused to surrender. Resistance during the Middle Passage was rare, but it happened. And when it did, it was powerful, even if fatal. Some enslaved people found ways to unshackle themselves and rebel against the crew. With bare hands and broken spirits, they fought back, sometimes overtaking ships, if only briefly. In a few cases, they turned the vessel around or jumped into the sea in a final act of defiance. These moments terrified slavers, who feared the very humanity they tried to erase. Suicide was also an act of resistance. Enslaved Africans who leapt into the ocean often did, so not out of despair alone, but from a belief that their souls would return home. Some legends spoke of dolphins guiding spirits back to Africa. Others whispered that death was freedom. Captains responded by installing nets along the ship's edge to prevent escapes. But many still found ways. They bit off their tongues. They strangled themselves with chains. They resisted even in death. And yet, survival was its own form of rebellion. Many clung to life not out of submission, but in silent defiance, to live long enough to remember, to carry songs, language, and faith across the sea. They whispered prayers in their native tongues. They braided seeds into their hair, okra, rice, black-eyed peas, symbols of future planting, of hope. Elders passed on oral histories, even in chains. Women sang lullabies to soothe weeping infants. In the belly of hell, they preserved identity, even when everything else was stolen. The Middle Passage was more than a journey. It was a crucible of horror and resistance, a dark tunnel between freedom and bondage. And when the ships reached shore, the nightmare wasn't over. It was only evolving. The journey across the Atlantic might have ended, but for the enslaved, the nightmare only deepened upon arrival. The moment the ship docked in ports like Charleston, Havana, or Kingston, the enslaved were not welcomed as survivors. They were treated as merchandise. Their bodies sick, bruised, and barely alive, were cleaned, oiled, and sometimes shaved to make them appear healthier. Wounds were covered with grease. The purpose was not mercy, but deception. Traders wanted them to fetch the highest price at auction. Men were separated from women. Children were torn from their mothers. Families that had survived the Middle Passage together were dismantled in an instant. On the auction block, enslaved people were forced to stand naked as buyers inspected them like cattle. Their teeth were checked, their muscles pinched, their backs examined for signs of resistance. Some buyers used canes to prod them or forced them to walk and jump to prove strength. Every part of them was evaluated, but not as human beings. As property, bidding began. It was loud, crude, and heartless. The young, the strong, the able-bodied fetched the highest prices. Women of childbearing age were also considered valuable, not just for labor, but for breeding. Children, too, were sold, sometimes alone, sometimes in lots. The unlucky were sent to seasoning camps, where they were tortured into obedience before being sold again. At the end of the auction, names were replaced. A boy named Kofi became Sam. A woman named Abina became Mary. Language, identity, lineage, all erased in a single day. These sales were often advertised in local newspapers, alongside livestock and furniture. It was business, and to slaveholders, it was a profitable one. But for the enslaved, the auction was a moment of ultimate despair, a moment where even hope seemed to be sold to the highest bidder. Life on the plantation was a brutal continuation of captivity. From the moment the sun rose, enslaved Africans were forced into relentless labor. In the sugarcane fields of the Caribbean, the cotton plantations of the American South, or the coffee estates of Brazil, the routine was the same. Backbreaking work under the whip. Men, women, and children alike were forced to toil from dawn until dusk, often under the scorching sun, with little rest and no rights. Overseers patrolled the fields on horseback, carrying whips and guns. Talking back meant punishment. Moving too slowly meant punishment. Refusing to work meant death. Whippings were public, meant to break the spirit of others. Bodies bore the scars of this violence, thick welts that never healed. Many enslaved women endured a double oppression, exploited not only for labor, but also sexually abused by slaveholders. Their children, born in bondage, were often sold away without warning. Housing for the enslaved was minimal. Cramped wooden shacks with dirt floors shared by multiple families. Food was basic, usually cornmeal, salted pork, or beans, just enough to keep them working. Illness was rampant and medical care rare. Sundays, if allowed, were the only day of rest, but even that was often consumed by personal labor or religious worship. Yet amid this suffering, enslaved people carved out moments of humanity. They created gardens, sang songs, told stories from Africa, and practiced spiritual traditions. These acts were more than survival. They were forms of silent resistance. To smile, to sing, to remember one's name, was to reclaim stolen dignity. The plantation was a place designed to crush the human soul. But for many, the will to survive and eventually to resist could not be extinguished. One of the most remarkable aspects of the enslaved experience was their determination to build community and preserve fragments of identity, even in the most dehumanizing conditions. Enslaved Africans forged families, not always by blood, but by bond. They created kinship networks that provided support, comfort, and protection. In a world where they had no legal rights, these relationships were acts of defiance. They held naming ceremonies, passed down oral histories, and looked after each other's children when parents were sold or died. Faith played a critical role. Many enslaved people practiced African spiritual traditions in secret, honoring ancestors, singing spirituals rooted in ritual, and preserving symbols of resistance. Others converted to Christianity, but reinterpreted it through the lens of liberation. Biblical stories like the Exodus, where Moses led the Israelites out of slavery, gave them hope. The song "Go Down Moses" wasn't just a hymn. It was a coded prayer for deliverance. Rebellion took many forms. There were large uprisings, such as the Stono Rebellion in 1739, the Haitian Revolution, or Nat Turner's Revolt. But resistance also lived in everyday acts, working slowly, breaking tools, faking illness, learning to read in secret, or escaping through networks like the Underground Railroad. Enslaved people who fled often risked death, yet many tried. Those who stayed resisted by keeping culture alive through music, dance, food, and memory. Love itself was resistance. To love one's child when that child could be sold any day. To sing to them, teach them, name them, was an act of revolutionary courage. The slaveholder could claim the body, but not always the soul. And that soul, though wounded, would become the seed of future freedom movements. In the darkest corners of bondage, enslaved people lit candles of hope, tiny flames that would one day blaze into revolution. In the late 18th century, on the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, the unthinkable was about to happen. Enslaved people were preparing to rise up against the most powerful empire on earth. France's richest colony, Saint-Domingue produced more wealth than any other. Its sugar, coffee, and indigo fields worked by nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans. The conditions were unspeakably brutal. Death rates were so high that plantation owners regularly imported new captives rather than sustaining generations. Yet within this crucible of suffering, something extraordinary ignited. A thirst for freedom that could not be extinguished. At the center of this storm stood a remarkable man, Toussaint Louverture. Born into slavery around 1743, Toussaint was unusually literate, fluent in French and Latin, and trained in medicine and horsemanship. Freed as an adult, he became a coachman, then an overseer, and eventually a leader among his peers. When revolution broke out in France in 1789, its promises of liberty, equality, fraternity echoed far beyond Paris. In 1791, enslaved people in the northern plains of Saint-Domingue launched a massive rebellion, burning plantations, killing masters, and declaring themselves free. Toussaint did not immediately join the revolt. He studied it. He watched. Then, when the moment was right, he emerged as a strategic genius. He organized troops, trained men in guerrilla tactics, negotiated with Spanish and French forces, and gradually united the fractured rebel armies under his command. He was no ordinary fighter. He was a visionary, declaring, "I was born a slave, but nature gave me the soul of a free man." As he rose, so too did the movement. And for the first time in history, the enslaved masses of an entire colony began to seriously challenge their colonial masters and win. The revolution in Saint-Domingue was not a single battle. It was a long, bloody struggle filled with shifting alliances, betrayals, and waves of violence. After years of fighting Spanish, British, and French forces, Toussaint Louverture emerged as the most powerful leader on the island. By 1801, he had abolished slavery across the colony and written a new constitution declaring himself governor for life. But France, now under Napoleon Bonaparte, had no intention of allowing a black-led colony to remain independent. In 1802, Napoleon sent an army of 40,000 soldiers under his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, to crush the revolution and restore slavery. Toussaint, ever the strategist, initially agreed to a ceasefire, but it was a trap. The French captured him during negotiations and sent him to France in chains. Imprisoned in a freezing dungeon in the Jura Mountains, Toussaint died of cold and starvation in 1803. But his final words echoed through history. "In overthrowing me, you have cut down only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are many and they are deep." And indeed, the roots remained. Leadership passed to Toussaint's lieutenant, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a fierce and ruthless general. Under Dessalines, the revolution intensified into a full-scale war of independence. In a stunning turn, the formerly enslaved army defeated Napoleon's forces, one of the greatest military upsets in world history. On January 1st, 1804, Haiti declared itself the first black republic and the first nation founded by formerly enslaved people. The name Haiti, taken from the Taino language, meant land of high mountains. A name reclaimed, a nation reborn. The success of the Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves across the world. For enslaved people in the Americas, it was a beacon of hope. For slaveholders and empires, it was a nightmare come true. The idea that enslaved people, deemed property, deemed inferior, could rise, fight, and win independence terrified the colonial world. Haiti became a symbol of resistance, but also a target of global punishment. European and American powers, fearing rebellion in their own territories, isolated the new nation. The United States, itself a slave-holding republic, refused to recognize Haiti for decades. France, humiliated and enraged, demanded reparations for lost property, a grotesque reversal of justice. In 1825, France forced Haiti to pay 150 million francs under threat of invasion. To meet these payments, Haiti was plunged into debt that would cripple its economy for generations. Haiti had won its freedom, but the world made it pay for its courage. Despite the hostility, Haiti's revolution inspired countless others. Across the Caribbean, in the American South, and in Latin America, whispers of Saint-Domingue passed from plantation to plantation. Enslaved people dreamed not just of escape, but of uprising. Leaders like Denmark VC, Gabriel Prosser, and Nat Turner would all later draw from Haiti's legacy. And yet, the Haitian Revolution remains under-acknowledged in mainstream history. Its heroes were black. Its victors were once enslaved. Its ideology was dangerous to the status quo. But its truth is unshakable. Freedom can be won, even by the most oppressed. Haiti did not ask for liberty. It claimed it with blood, fire, and unyielding will. Even under the shadow of whips and the threat of death, enslaved people across the Americas never stopped dreaming of freedom. Some plotted quietly, others spoke boldly, and a few dared to ignite revolts that rocked the foundations of slavery itself. Among them, three names stand out in the United States: Gabriel Prosser, Denmark VC, and Nat Turner. Men who rose not just as rebels, but as prophets, preachers, and warriors of liberation. Gabriel Prosser, a literate blacksmith enslaved in Virginia, was inspired by the Haitian Revolution and the rhetoric of the American Revolution. In 1800, He organized a planned uprising involving hundreds of enslaved people. The goal: to capture Richmond, hold the governor hostage, and demand abolition. Armed with makeshift weapons and unwavering courage, Gabriel's plan was bold. But the night before the rebellion, a severe storm delayed their march, and 2 enslaved informants betrayed the plot. Gabriel was captured, tried, and hanged, along with 25 others. But his vision of coordinated rebellion and political action left a powerful legacy. Denmark VC, a former enslaved man who bought his freedom in Charleston, South Carolina, was a charismatic preacher and organizer. In 1822, he planned one of the most ambitious revolts in U.S. history. His network included free and enslaved black people, house servants, and dock workers. They aimed to kill slaveholders, seize ships, and sail to Haiti. Like Gabriel, VC was betrayed before the plan could unfold. He and 34 co-conspirators were executed, and dozens more were exiled. But his memory lingered in churches, whispered in secret, and invoked in future freedom movements. And then came Nat Turner in 1831, a deeply religious preacher from Southampton County, Virginia, who believed he was chosen by God to bring judgment upon slavery. Turner led a rebellion of around 70 enslaved men, moving from plantation to plantation, killing slaveholders and freeing the enslaved. Over 2 days, nearly 60 white people were killed. The retaliation was brutal. White militias killed hundreds of black people, many uninvolved. Turner was eventually captured and hanged. But his rebellion sent shockwaves across the South and terrified slaveholders. It was proof that the fire of resistance could not be extinguished. While many resisted through open rebellion, others escaped and built new worlds, far from the gaze of the plantation. These were the Maroons, communities of formerly enslaved people who fled bondage and survived in mountains, swamps, and forests across the Americas. From the Blue Mountains of Jamaica to the jungles of Suriname and the swamps of Florida, Maroon societies became sanctuaries of freedom and resistance. In Jamaica, the Maroons were fierce warriors. After escaping into the island's rugged interior, they organized themselves into militarized villages. Under leaders like Queen Nanny of the Maroons, they waged a decades-long guerrilla war against the British in the 18th century. Their knowledge of the terrain and tactics made them nearly impossible to defeat. The British were forced to sign treaties with them, granting them land and partial autonomy. Though fragile, these agreements were a recognition that the enslaved could fight empire and win. In Brazil, escaped Africans formed massive quilombos, the most famous being Palmares, which survived nearly a century and housed tens of thousands. Palmares had farms, trade systems, and even its own military, led by the legendary warrior Zumbi dos Palmares, who became a symbol of black resistance in Latin America. In Suriname, Maroon communities like the Saramacca and Dayuca established settlements deep in the jungle and fought repeated battles with Dutch colonists. These communities preserved African languages, religions, and governance structures. They were more than places of refuge. They were cultural strongholds, where stolen identities were revived and new, creolized cultures were born. They offered hope to the enslaved and fear to the colonizers. Runaways risked everything to reach them, traveling under moonlight, guided by whispers, drums, and faith. Maroon societies stood as living proof that freedom, once tasted, would never be forgotten. Not all resistance wore chains or carried swords. Many enslaved Africans fought back through the preservation of culture, through music, language, and spiritual memory. On the surface, a song might sound like a lullaby, a dance like entertainment, a prayer like devotion. But underneath, these acts were tools of rebellion, ways to survive, to remember, and to defy. Music was one of the most powerful weapons of cultural survival. Drums, forbidden by many slaveholders, were used to communicate across distances, encode messages, and retain African rhythms. Spirituals, songs like Wade in the Water or Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, carried double meanings, religious on the surface, but rich with hidden messages about escape and resistance. Call and response, improvisation, and polyrhythms rooted in Africa evolved into gospel, blues, jazz, and more. Every note carried a lineage of endurance. Language was reshaped, blended, and reborn. Creole languages emerged in the Caribbean and the American South, fusing African syntax with European vocabulary. In places like Gullah Geechee communities of South Carolina and Georgia, the descendants of enslaved Africans still speak dialects that preserve centuries-old African expressions. These languages kept stories alive and encoded histories that were never written down. Memory was perhaps the most resilient form of resistance. Elders told stories of Africa, of kings and queens, gods and warriors. Even when names were lost and families torn apart, the act of remembering became sacred. Oral history was passed from grandmother to grandchild, preserving identity where no written record existed. Hairstyles, foods, rituals, every cultural fragment carried ancestral echoes. To cook okra stew, to wear cornrows, to whisper old proverbs, these were not just customs. They were defiant acts of preservation. In a world designed to erase them, enslaved Africans carved space for themselves. Through culture, they reclaimed their humanity, kept their stories alive, and laid the foundation for future generations to rise. At the heart of the transatlantic slave trade was profit. Slavery was not simply a system of cruelty. It was an engine of global wealth. The bodies of enslaved Africans became the foundation of empires, their labor producing commodities that reshaped economies on both sides of the Atlantic. Chief among these were sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee, luxury goods turned into daily necessities by the sweat and blood of enslaved people. Sugar was the first grain driver. In the Caribbean, vast plantations covered Jamaica, Barbados, and Saint-Domingue. Cutting sugarcane was among the harshest forms of labor. Razor-sharp stalks sliced workers' skin, while boiling houses scalded them in deadly accidents. Yet Europe's appetite for sweetness was insatiable. By the 18th century, sugar had transformed from a rare spice to a household staple, sweetening tea, coffee, and desserts for the wealthy and the working class alike. Behind every spoonful lay lives cut short in the cane fields. Then came cotton, the white gold of the American South. With the invention of Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793, demand for enslaved labor skyrocketed. Cotton fed the looms of Britain's textile mills, fueling the Industrial Revolution. Slave-grown cotton was shipped across the Atlantic, woven into fabric in Manchester or Liverpool, then sold back to the colonies or across Europe. It was a cycle of exploitation. The enslaved produced raw material that enriched nations which denied them humanity. Tobacco and coffee also played their part. Virginia's tobacco plantations laid the foundation of America's colonial wealth, while Brazil rose to dominance through coffee exports, all grown by enslaved hands. Together, these crops reshaped diets, economies, and societies. And at the center of it all was the enslaved African, reduced to a unit of production, yet carrying the entire weight of global prosperity. It is no exaggeration to say that without slavery, modern capitalism, as we know it, would not exist. The plantation was the first factory, and the enslaved were its unwilling workers. Slavery was not just about plantations and overseers. It was also about banks, financiers, and investors who turned human suffering into financial opportunity. The transatlantic slave trade was a massive business enterprise that connected rural fields to urban banks, coastal forts to European capitals. Behind the violence of the whip lay the silent cruelty of ledgers, contracts, and loans. Slave voyages were financed like modern corporations. Investors pooled money to fund expeditions, hoping for high returns when ships returned laden with sugar, cotton, or enslaved people. Merchants in London, Amsterdam, and Lisbon calculated profits down to the last penny. Insurance companies, such as Lloyd's of London, wrote policies that treated human beings as cargo. If enslaved Africans died during the voyage, insurers often reimbursed the shipowners, not for lives lost, but for damaged property. In one notorious case, the Zone Massacre of 1781, over 130 enslaved Africans were thrown overboard so that the owners could claim insurance money for jettisoned cargo. Courts debated compensation for lost property, but not justice for murdered souls. Banks grew rich on this blood money. The Royal Bank of Scotland, Barclays, and others all had ties to slavery. Loans were issued to planters, secured against enslaved lives. Mortgages were signed on human bodies. Universities like Harvard, Yale, and Oxford benefited from endowments funded by the trade. Even governments reaped taxes from every pound of sugar, every barrel of rum, every bale of cotton that crossed the Atlantic. For the enslaved, this meant their very existence was financialized. They were born not as children, but as assets, with a market value recorded in account books. This dehumanization reached its cruelest form in auctions where enslaved people were sold with itemized descriptions, alongside livestock or furniture. They were not men, women, or children. They were property, collateral, risk, and profit. Slavery was not just brutality. It was capitalism in its purest, most ruthless form. The echoes of slavery extend far beyond the plantation. They are embedded in the modern world we inhabit. The profits from the transatlantic slave trade financed roads, ports, universities, and factories. They helped build London's docks, Liverpool's warehouses, Bordeaux's grand avenues, and Amsterdam's canals. The great wealth of European empires, wealth that funded their rise to global dominance, was soaked in the blood of Africa. The Industrial Revolution itself leaned heavily on slavery. British textile mills thrived on American cotton, produced by enslaved hands. Sugar fueled the diets of factory workers. Coffee powered Europe's growing workforce. Banks and insurers developed models of finance that still underpin today's economic systems. Credit, risk management, corporate investment, all perfected on the back of human trafficking. The triangular trade. Europe to Africa, Africa to the Americas back to Europe, was the first truly global economy. It set the blueprint for modern globalization. Even cultural institutions bear this legacy. Museums in Paris and London house artifacts collected during colonial expansion, funded by slavery's profits. Universities educated generations of elites on the wealth extracted from enslaved people. The irony is cruel. Ideas of liberty, equality, and enlightenment were debated in salons lit by candles made from sugar profits and tobacco wealth. The enslaved did not just labor, they built nations. Washington, D.C. was constructed by enslaved Africans. New York's Wall Street was once a slave market. Charleston, Havana, and Rio de Janeiro all owe their prosperity to slavery. Even after abolition, the wealth remained in white hands, while formerly enslaved people were left with nothing but poverty, scars, and shattered families. The modern capitalist world was not born in boardrooms alone. It was birthed in the fields of Jamaica, the cotton rows of Mississippi, the sugar mills of Brazil. Every banknote, every factory, every mansion carried the silent testimony of the enslaved. To understand today's wealth gaps, global inequalities, and racial divides, one must first understand this truth. slavery was not a footnote in history. It was the foundation. By the late 18th century, cracks began to appear in the mighty edifice of slavery. In Britain, the beating heart of the transatlantic trade, a new movement was rising, one that dared to question the morality of human bondage. It began as whispers in churches, pamphlets in London coffee houses, and testimonies in Parliament. At its center were both white reformers and formerly enslaved Africans whose voices carried the unbearable weight of truth. Among the most famous abolitionists was William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament whose speeches in the House of Commons denounced the cruelty of the slave trade. Yet Wilberforce was not alone. He was part of a broader network known as the Clapham sect, evangelical Christians who saw slavery as incompatible with faith. They mobilized petitions, organized boycotts of slave-produced sugar, and pushed for legislative change. But moral arguments alone would not have moved the empire without the testimony of those who had lived the horrors firsthand. Enter Olaudah Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vassa, a man stolen from Africa as a child, enslaved, and eventually freed. His autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, 1789, shook Britain to its core. Equiano described in searing detail the Middle Passage, the brutality of slavery, and his eventual fight for freedom. His words gave the abolitionist cause a human face. Likewise, Ottobah Cugoano, another African voice, condemned slavery in fiery terms, arguing that no Christian nation could claim righteousness while trading in human lives. The movement spread beyond Parliament. Churches thundered against slavery from the pulpit. Artists like Josiah Wedgwood created the iconic image of an enslaved man in chains, kneeling with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This symbol became a rallying cry, printed on medallions, teacups, and pamphlets across Britain. Ordinary people, especially women, became key actors, organizing boycotts of sugar and lobbying politicians. What began as a small moral campaign soon swelled into a nationwide demand for change. By 1807, the pressure was unstoppable. Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, banning the trafficking of enslaved people in the British Empire. It was a monumental step, but slavery itself continued. The fight was far from over, yet the tide had turned. The empire built on bondage was now facing a reckoning. Across the Atlantic in the United States, the battle for abolition was fierce and deeply tied to the nation's identity. America had declared itself a land of liberty in 1776, yet millions remained enslaved within its borders. This contradiction gave rise to some of the most passionate voices of resistance, both black and white, who demanded that the country live up to its own ideals. Among the white abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison stood out. A fiery journalist, he founded The Liberator in 1831, a newspaper dedicated entirely to abolition. His words were uncompromising. "I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." He condemned not only slavery, but also the political compromises that protected it. For his radicalism, he was hated in the South and often threatened with violence. But he became a beacon for the abolitionist movement. Yet the most powerful voices came from those who had lived in chains. Frederick Douglass, born enslaved in Maryland, escaped to the North and became one of history's greatest orators and writers. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, 1845, revealed the brutal realities of slavery and his path to freedom. Douglass thundered in speeches across America and Britain, exposing slavery as a crime against humanity. His voice combined intellect, moral force, and lived experience, making him one of the most effective abolitionists of all time. Resistance also took physical form in the Underground Railroad, a vast, secret network of routes and safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to the North and Canada. Figures like Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped slave, risked her life repeatedly to guide others to freedom. Called Moses by those she freed, Tubman led dozens to safety, armed with courage, faith, and sheer determination. Each escape was a direct challenge to the slave system, each freed soul a victory against tyranny. The American abolition movement was deeply divided. Some argued for gradual emancipation, others demanded immediate abolition. Some believed in moral persuasion, others in armed resistance. But despite differences, the movement grew in strength, making slavery a central and explosive issue in American politics. The voices of Garrison, Douglas, Tubman, and countless unnamed activists created a storm that would eventually engulf the nation in civil war. Abolition was never only about politics. It was also about faith, morality, and the reawakening of human conscience. Across Europe, the Americas, and Africa, religious leaders, writers, and ordinary people came to see slavery not simply as an economic system, but as a sin. The Quakers were among the earliest to denounce slavery, declaring in the 1600s that no man could own another. Their steadfast commitment, often at great personal cost, laid the groundwork for broader movements to follow. Christianity, long twisted by slaveholders to justify bondage, was reclaimed by abolitionists as a weapon of liberation. Preachers thundered that God made all men equal, that Christ came for every soul, and that the Exodus story was not just ancient history, but a promise of deliverance for the enslaved. Hymns sung in churches merged with the spirituals of the enslaved, creating a shared language of resistance. Faith gave courage, faith gave vision, and faith gave the assurance that slavery's days were numbered. The moral argument gained strength in literature as well. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, though controversial in its portrayals, electrified public opinion in the North. Victor Hugo in France, Alexander Pushkin in Russia, and other global figures added their voices against slavery. The abolitionist press, pamphlets, and petitions spread across borders, creating a network of conscience that made it harder for governments to ignore. By the mid-19th century, abolition was no longer a fringe cause. It was a global movement. Britain ended slavery itself in 1833. France abolished it again in 1848. Other European nations followed. Yet the struggle was uneven. In the United States, it would take the Civil War to finally end slavery. In Brazil, the last nation in the Americas to abolish, freedom did not come until 1888. Still, the abolitionist movement had changed the moral landscape of the world. It declared, once and for all, that slavery was not merely an unfortunate institution. It was a crime against God and humanity. And though abolition legally ended the trade, its legacies, the scars, the racism, the economic inequalities would endure. The abolitionists won the battle to end slavery, but the war for true freedom and equality had only just begun. By the mid-19th century, the United States stood on the brink of collapse. It called itself the land of the free, yet millions of people remained enslaved within its borders. For decades, politicians had tried to paper over this contradiction with fragile compromises. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But no law could conceal the truth. Slavery was the central question dividing the nation, and no middle ground would hold forever. The South's economy depended on slavery. Cotton, cultivated by enslaved labor, was its lifeblood. The North, increasingly industrialized, benefited from Southern cotton, but had growing abolitionist movements that denounced slavery as immoral and incompatible with democracy. Tensions flared in violent clashes, such as Bleeding Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought brutally for dominance. The Supreme Court's infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857 declared that black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This ruling confirmed the fears of many that the system of bondage was expanding, not retreating. The breaking point came in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Though Lincoln initially pledged not to abolish slavery where it already existed, Southern states saw his victory as a threat to their way of life. One by one, they seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. Their new Constitution explicitly protected slavery as their cornerstone. In his infamous Cornerstone speech, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens declared, "Our new government is founded upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man." The North fought to preserve the Union. The South fought to preserve slavery. In April 1861, Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War began. What followed would be the bloodiest conflict in American history, costing over 600,000 lives. But beneath every battlefield, every charge, every cannon blast, the real war was about slavery, its preservation or its destruction. The question of freedom was no longer a matter of debate. It would be settled in blood. As the Civil War raged on, enslaved people themselves forced the issue of freedom onto the Union's agenda. From the war's earliest days, thousands fled plantations and sought refuge behind Union lines. Some were returned, but others were declared contraband of war by Union generals, refusing to send them back to Confederate owners. These escapes revealed the truth. The enslaved were not passive. They understood that this war could be their path to liberation, and they would take it. By 1862, Lincoln recognized that slavery was the Confederacy's backbone. To destroy the rebellion, slavery had to be attacked. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate territory were free. While it did not immediately end slavery everywhere, it transformed the war's purpose. The Union was no longer fighting just to preserve the nation. It was fighting to abolish slavery. The proclamation also opened the door for African Americans to join the Union Army. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors would eventually fight for the Union, making up about 10% of its forces. These men were not only battling the Confederacy, they were fighting for their own freedom and the freedom of millions still in bondage. Units like the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, became symbols of black courage. At the assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, the 54th fought valiantly, suffering heavy casualties, but proving beyond doubt that African Americans would shed blood for liberty. For the enslaved, the arrival of Union troops often meant liberation. Plantations emptied as men, women, and children followed the Union Army, seeking safety and freedom. But freedom was fragile. Some Union commanders welcomed them, others exploited or mistreated them. Still, for those who had been bound in chains, every step toward Union lines was a step toward reclaiming humanity. The war was transforming into a revolution, not just a battle for territory, but a battle to redefine the very meaning of America. Could it be a nation truly founded on liberty? Or would slavery remain its eternal stain? By 1865, the Confederacy was collapsing. Sherman's march to the sea had devastated the South, and Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse signaled the war's end. With the 13th Amendment ratified later that year, slavery was abolished throughout the United States. For the first time in centuries, nearly 4 million enslaved men, women, and children were legally free. The moment was monumental. Jubilation erupted across the South as freedom was proclaimed. Families reunited, churches rang with songs of deliverance, and newly freed people established schools, farms, and communities. The dream of freedom had finally been realized. Yet liberation came with bitter costs. The South lay in ruins, its economy shattered. The North, though victorious, was weary of war. And the freedmen faced new challenges: poverty, racism, and violence. The promise of Reconstruction, the attempt to rebuild the South and grant equal rights to African Americans, was met with fierce resistance. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, terrorizing black communities. The same soldiers who had fought for freedom now found themselves hunted, denied land, and pushed into sharecropping contracts that resembled slavery in all but name. Worse still, America betrayed its promises. Though the 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting rights to black men, these gains were systematically undermined in the decades that followed. Jim Crow laws, segregation, lynchings, and disenfranchisement spread across the South. The Civil War had ended slavery, but it had not ended oppression. Freedom, though written into law, remained fragile in practice. And yet, the courage of those who fought, enslaved and free, had changed a nation forever. Black soldiers had proven their valor. Abolitionists had secured a victory once thought impossible. The legacy of emancipation would inspire future generations in the struggle for civil rights. But the cost was immense. Millions scarred, families shattered, and a nation forever haunted by the war it waged against itself. The Civil War ended one chapter of slavery's story, but it was not the end of the struggle. The chains had been broken, but the shadows of bondage remained. The fight for true freedom had only just begun. If the United States Civil War ended slavery in 1865, Brazil continued the practice for more than 2 decades longer. Brazil was the last nation in the Americas to abolish slavery, finally doing so in 1888 with the passage of the Golden Law, Lei Áurea. By then, nearly 5 million Africans have been brought to Brazil over the centuries, far more than any other country in the Americas. This staggering number made Brazil not just the last, but also one of the greatest centers of human bondage in history. The foundation of Brazilian wealth lay in sugar plantations, later expanded into coffee production during the 19th century. Enslaved Africans cut cane in the Northeast under merciless heat, bent double for endless hours, their bodies sliced by the sharp stalks. Others labored in vast coffee fields in Sao Paulo, their sweat fueling the drink that was becoming a global staple. Mortality rates were devastatingly high. Enslaved people often lived only a handful of years after arrival. Unlike in the U.S., where natural population growth among enslaved people eventually sustained the labor force, Brazil's system consumed lives so quickly that constant new imports from Africa were required. Resistance in Brazil was fierce. Enslaved Africans fled plantations and formed quilombos, hidden communities of freedom in remote jungles and mountains. The most famous was Palmares, a maroon state that lasted for nearly a century and at its height housed tens of thousands. Its leader, Zumbi dos Palmares, became a legendary figure, remembered as a warrior who defied colonial powers until his death in 1695. Smaller quilombos existed across the country, providing sanctuaries for fugitives and sinners of rebellion. By the late 19th century, pressure against slavery mounted. Britain, having abolished slavery, pressured Brazil to end the trade. Abolitionist movements, newspapers, and black activists grew bolder, staging protests and aiding runaways. Enslaved people themselves abandoned plantations en masse, weakening the system from within. Finally, on May 13, 1888, Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, abolishing slavery with a single sentence. No compensation was given to slaveholders, but tragically, no reparations or land were given to the formerly enslaved either. Freedom came, but with poverty and exclusion. Brazil had ended legal slavery, but its shadow lingered, shaping society long after chains were gone. Like Brazil, Cuba remained enslaved deep into the 19th century, its economy chained to sugar production. The island's fertile soil made it the world's largest sugar exporter by the mid-1800s, and enslaved Africans bore the crushing weight of this industry. Sugar cultivation was relentless. Fields stretched for miles, mills ran day and night, and enslaved people worked to exhaustion, often chained, whipped, and denied the most basic human needs. The sound of grinding cane became the sound of lives being consumed. Cuba imported over 1 million Africans, making it one of the largest recipients of enslaved labor in the Americas. The brutality of Cuban plantations was infamous. Enslaved workers were forced into grueling 18-hour shifts, particularly during harvest season, when mills operated without pause. Overseers wielded the lash freely, and punishments such as mutilation and execution were common. Women endured sexual violence on a horrific scale, and children were pushed into labor before their bodies were ready. But resistance flared. Thousands fled into the Cuban countryside, creating networks of fugitives who fought back against plantation owners. Others joined conspiracies for rebellion. The most famous was the La Escalera Conspiracy of 1844, in which enslaved Africans and free black people planned a massive uprising. When the plot was discovered, Spanish authorities unleashed brutal reprisals. Hundreds were executed, tortured, or imprisoned. The violence terrified the ruling class, but also revealed how close Cuba was to erupting. Cuba's path to abolition was tied to its wars for independence from Spain. Between 1868 and 1878, and again in the 1890s, revolutionaries demanded both political freedom and the end of slavery. Enslaved men joined rebel armies, fighting with the hope of liberation. By 1886, under pressure from internal revolt and international criticism, Spain finally abolished slavery in Cuba. Like Brazil, the end was legal, but the hardships for freed people continued. They left the cane fields without land or resources, still trapped in cycles of poverty. Yet their struggle helped lay the foundation for Cuba's future revolutions, proof that the dream of freedom could survive centuries of oppression. Why did slavery persist so long in Brazil, Cuba, and other parts of the Americas, even after Britain and the U.S. had abolished it? The answer lies in a cruel mix of economic greed, racial ideology, and global politics. First, slavery was staggeringly profitable. Sugar, coffee, and tobacco were commodities in global demand, enriching plantation elites and feeding the economies of Europe. Abolishing slavery meant dismantling the very backbone of wealth for powerful landowners and colonial rulers. In places like Cuba and Brazil, planters clung desperately to the system, resisting change with violence and political maneuvering. Second, racism hardened into a justification for slavery survival. As abolitionist voices grew louder, defenders of slavery doubled down on the lie that Africans were naturally suited for bondage. Pseudoscientific theories of racial hierarchy gained popularity in the 19th century, providing a modern mask for ancient exploitation. Enslaved people were dehumanized not only by law, but by ideology, making their suffering invisible to those who profited. Finally, geopolitics played a role. European powers and the United States had complex relationships with Brazil and Cuba, sometimes condemning slavery in words while continuing to buy their sugar and coffee in practice. Britain pressured nations to end the slave trade, but rarely punished them harshly when profits flowed. The hypocrisy of international diplomacy allowed slavery to linger. When slavery finally ended in Brazil, 1888, and Cuba, 1886, it was not simply because governments passed laws. It was because enslaved people themselves resisted, escaped, rebelled, and made the system unsustainable. Yet the delay in abolition left a lasting scar. Freed people entered societies that had never planned to integrate them as equals. Landless, impoverished, and discriminated against, they faced new forms of bondage, sharecropping, debt labor, and segregation. Thus, slavery lasted so long in the Americas not because it was natural, but because it was profitable, and profit made the world look away. The long struggle for freedom was a testament to the courage of the enslaved, who refused to let chains define them even when the world seemed unwilling to let them go. The most devastating wound inflicted by slavery was the destruction of families. Across centuries and continents, millions of mothers, fathers, children, and siblings were torn apart, sold to different plantations, or shipped to separate colonies. Family bonds, so central to African life, were deliberately shattered to weaken resistance. Slaveholders knew that a man without his wife, a mother without her child, was easier to control. To destroy kinship was to destroy community, and this became one of slavery's most insidious tools. On the auction block, families were separated with cruel efficiency. A father might be sold to a plantation in Louisiana, while his wife and children were sent to Mississippi. Children as young as 5 were ripped from their mother's arms and sold alone. These were not rare exceptions. They were routine. Newspaper advertisements in the 19th century listed enslaved people for sale by lots, sometimes specifying that a child was being sold without its mother. The coldness of such transactions masked the screams, tears, and heartbreak that haunted generations. Enslaved parents did everything they could to resist this destruction. Mothers braided seeds into their children's hair as a gift of survival, hoping those seeds would grow in whatever land their children were taken to. Fathers taught stories and songs that carried ancestral memory, even when they knew they might not see their children again. Some enslaved families fled together into swamps or forests, risking death rather than separation. Others, when forced apart, carried each other in memory, whispering names across years of absence. The trauma of broken families did not end with emancipation. After slavery, many freed people spent decades searching for lost relatives. Newspapers were filled with information wanted, ads placed by former slaves trying to find children or spouses sold years earlier. Some found each other, many did not. These missing generations remain scars in family trees, silent voids where names and faces should be. Slavery was not just about labor. It was about the deliberate dismantling of love and kinship. In tearing families apart, it created wounds that time has never fully healed. Slavery did not only bind bodies, it scarred minds. The psychological toll was immense, leaving marks that carried forward through generations. To live under slavery was to exist in constant fear. Fear of the whip, fear of sale, fear of losing loved ones. The unpredictability of violence created what today we would call trauma, though enslaved people had no word for it. They lived with the daily knowledge that their lives were not their own, that at any moment, everything they valued could be taken. One of the cruelest aspects of slavery was the attempt to erase cultural identity. Enslaved Africans were stripped of names and forced to adopt European ones. Languages like Yoruba, Igbo, and Kikongo were suppressed, replaced by English, Portuguese, or Spanish. Traditional religions were condemned as pagan and replaced with Christianity, though enslaved people often reinterpreted Christianity to suit their own struggles for liberation. Music, Dance and oral traditions were sometimes forbidden, yet they survived in secret, evolving into new forms. But with every prohibition came loss. Entire lineages of songs, proverbs, and spiritual practices vanished under the weight of silence. The enslaved also internalized shame. They were told daily that they were inferior, subhuman, destined only for labor. Some resisted these lies fiercely, others struggled under their weight. Generations grew up never knowing the history of their ancestors, forced to believe the narratives written by their oppressors. This psychological assault was as damaging as physical chains, for it attempted to convince the enslaved that they had no past worth remembering. And yet, despite the attempt to erase culture, fragments survived. African rhythms pulsed in spirituals. Folktales carried wisdom across oceans. Foods like rice, okra, and black-eyed peas kept culinary traditions alive. These survivals became acts of resilience. But the loss was still immense. Entire cultural landscapes disappeared, leaving a sense of dislocation that continues to echo. The psychological legacy of slavery is not confined to history. Its patterns of trauma, broken families, internalized oppression, cultural dislocation were passed down, shaping how descendants saw themselves and were seen by society. It created wounds that would later fuel struggles for civil rights and cultural rebirth. Slavery may have legally ended in the 19th century, but its wounds were carried forward in ways both visible and invisible. These are intergenerational traumas, the transmission of suffering from one generation to the next, not only through memory, but through economic, social, and political realities. Freed people began life after emancipation with nothing. No land, no compensation, no security. Many were forced into sharecropping, a system that trapped them in debt and kept them tied to the very plantations they had once labored on. Freedom came without equality. Children of the formerly enslaved inherited poverty as their starting point. They were denied access to education in many regions or given inferior schools designed to keep them subordinate. Legal systems remained hostile, enforcing segregation and punishing black mobility. Violence, from lynchings to massacres, reinforced the message that black freedom was conditional. Thus, the trauma of slavery persisted, not as memory alone, but as lived reality. The psychological impact of slavery also carried forward. Parents who had endured whippings or witnessed loved ones sold often raised their children with caution born of fear. Generations were taught to be wary, to survive in a world that still devalued their lives. Cultural memory carried both pride in survival and pain and loss. Spiritual songs sung during slavery became anthems for later generations, linking struggles across time. Modern research shows how trauma can shape biology, passed down in stress responses and mental health patterns. In this sense, the pain of slavery is written not only in history books, but in bodies and minds today. The enduring inequalities of wealth, education, and opportunity between black and white communities in the Americas are direct descendants of slavery's unfinished business. Yet within these wounds is also resilience. Descendants of the enslaved built new cultures: jazz, blues, gospel, literature, art, and political movements that transformed the world. The trauma of slavery forged not only scars but also strength, inspiring generations to rise against injustice. Still, the intergenerational wounds remain. To heal them requires not forgetting, but remembering, acknowledging that slavery was not only a historical event, but a living legacy that still shapes the present. When Britain abolished slavery in 1833, many expected the enslaved in the Caribbean to walk into full freedom. But what came instead was a bitter compromise: the apprenticeship system. This scheme, lasting from 1834 to 1838, was designed not to free the formerly enslaved, but to ease plantation owners into a world without slavery, while keeping black labor under tight control. Under apprenticeship, the enslaved were declared free in name, but were required to continue working for their former masters for a set number of years, often without pay or with only minimal wages. The idea was presented as a transition period, but in reality, it was a disguised extension of slavery. Apprentices were forced to work 40 to 45 hours per week without wages, and if they refused, they were punished, whipped, imprisoned, or fined. Plantation owners were compensated with millions of pounds by the British government for the loss of property, but the freed received nothing. The system was deeply unjust. The enslaved, who had given generations of unpaid labor, were expected to repay their masters with more years of work. The reality of apprenticeship sparked frustration and anger. Formerly enslaved men and women resisted in both small and large ways. Some refused to work the required hours, others protested in courts, and many turned to religious leaders, especially those from Baptist and Methodist churches who had supported abolition. These churches became centers of organizing, where the newly freed discussed their rights and plotted strategies for true freedom. The hypocrisy of apprenticeship quickly became obvious. Reports of abuses poured into Britain, where abolitionists who had campaigned against slavery now rallied against this false freedom. By 1838, under relentless pressure from activists and uprisings in the colonies, apprenticeship was abolished, and the formerly enslaved were finally granted full emancipation. Yet by then, the message was clear. Freedom would always be undermined when the interests of former masters were placed above the dignity of the freed. Emancipation had come, but equality remained a distant dream. With the end of apprenticeship, plantation owners in the Caribbean faced a crisis. They no longer had absolute control over black labor. Freed men and women, though still desperately poor, began to assert their independence. Many refused to work on plantations under the same conditions as before. They sought small plots of land, turned to subsistence farming, or negotiated higher wages. This defiance threatened the sugar industry, which still dominated the Caribbean economy. In response, planters turned to a new system, indentured labor. They imported workers from India, China, and other parts of the world under contracts that bound them to years of labor in exchange for passage, small wages, and the promise of land or return tickets. Between the 1830s and early 20th century, hundreds of thousands of Indians were brought to colonies such as Trinidad, Guyana, and Jamaica. Chinese laborers also arrived in smaller numbers. While not technically enslaved, indentured workers lived under harsh conditions. Long hours, poor pay, strict discipline, and restrictions on movement. Many died from overwork and disease, and their contracts often resembled slavery in everything but name. For the freed Africans, the arrival of indentured workers added new struggles. Planters deliberately used them to undercut wages and sow division between communities. Racial hierarchies hardened, with whites at the top, indentured workers, and freed blacks competing at the bottom. Yet over time, Afro-Caribbean and Indo-Caribbean communities both developed vibrant cultures, blending traditions, languages, and foods that reshaped the Caribbean identity. Still, the fact remained. The plantation system survived abolition by reinventing itself. The same fields where enslaved Africans had labored were now worked by new populations, bound by contracts that echoed chains. Emancipation had ended legal slavery, but the economic structures of exploitation remained deeply intact, ensuring that the wealth of the Caribbean continued to flow outward to European empires rather than nourishing the freed themselves. Despite the betrayals of apprenticeship and the exploitation of indentured labor, The Caribbean, after emancipation, also witnessed something extraordinary: a cultural rebirth. Freed Africans, for the first time in centuries, began to rebuild their lives on their own terms. Though land was scarce and poverty widespread, they formed new villages, established independent churches, and revived cultural traditions that slavery had tried to erase. Music became a powerful expression of this new freedom. In Jamaica, spirituals and African rhythms evolved into early forms of minto and, later, reggae. In Trinidad, the fusion of African drumming and European carnival traditions gave birth to calypso and steel pan music. Across the islands, drumming, dance, and song became tools of storytelling, resistance, and celebration. What had once been forbidden under slavery now flourished as symbols of identity. Religion also played a central role. Christianity remained dominant, but freed Africans reshaped it into something uniquely their own, blending biblical teachings with African spiritual practices. Revivalist churches emphasized freedom, equality, and spiritual empowerment, while Afro-Caribbean religions like Obia, Vodou, and Santeria preserved ancestral wisdom. These spiritual traditions gave the freed not only hope, but also a sense of continuity with Africa. Education, too, became a cornerstone. Mission schools spread across the Caribbean, and freed families sacrificed greatly to ensure their children could read and write. Literacy became both a practical tool for economic survival and a symbolic weapon against oppression. Formerly enslaved people who had once been forbidden to read now demanded knowledge, determined that future generations would not be bound by ignorance. The hardships of post-slavery life were immense. Landlessness, economic exploitation, and racial discrimination persisted. Yet amid these struggles, Caribbean societies laid the foundations of resilience. They transformed pain into creativity, oppression into identity, and exile into belonging. This cultural renaissance was itself a form of resistance, proving that even when freedom was compromised, the human spirit could not be broken. While the Transatlantic Slave Trade reshaped the Americas, its wounds were felt most deeply in Africa itself. The trade did not simply remove millions of people from the continent. It destabilized entire kingdoms, corrupted traditional politics, and triggered a cycle of violence that hollowed out societies. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, African rulers, merchants, and warlords found themselves entangled in a trade they could not escape, one that pitted communities against one another and tore apart ancient systems of governance. Some kingdoms, such as Dahomey, the Ashanti Empire, and the Oyo Empire, became heavily involved in supplying captives. They waged wars and conducted raids to capture prisoners, who were then sold to European traders in exchange for guns, alcohol, and manufactured goods. This trade altered the very nature of African warfare. Battles once fought for territory or honor now became battles fought for human lives, to be sold as currency. The influx of European firearms made conflicts deadlier, fueling an arms race that trapped kingdoms in a cycle of violence. To defend themselves, they needed weapons. To get weapons, they needed captives. To obtain captives, they waged more wars. Not all rulers accepted this logic. Some, like King Nzinga Afonso I of Congo, recognized early the devastation this trade was bringing. In letters to the King of Portugal, he pleaded for the end of the slave trade, warning that his kingdom was being depopulated and corrupted. His appeals were ignored. The profits were simply too immense for Europeans to stop, and the local pressures too strong for African leaders to resist. Over time, many African societies crumbled under the weight of this exploitation. Smaller communities were destroyed or absorbed into larger empires, while once thriving kingdoms collapsed entirely. The political fragmentation left Africa weakened, vulnerable not only to internal chaos, but eventually to European colonial conquest in the 19th century. The slave trade was not just an external wound. It was a poison that seeped into Africa's political veins, weakening it from within. The economic and demographic impact of the transatlantic slave trade on Africa was catastrophic. Historians estimate that between 12 to 15 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. But when we include those who died during raids, forced marches, and captivity before reaching the ships, the number of lives lost may exceed 20 million. This was not just a tragedy of numbers. It was the removal of Africa's most productive population. The majority of those taken were young men and women, those in their physical prime, who would have been the farmers, artisans, warriors, and parents of future generations. The loss of so many destabilized Africa's economies. Traditional industries like agriculture, ironworking, and crafts suffered as people were captured or killed. Instead of producing for local needs, many societies became oriented toward capturing and selling humans. In some regions, fertile land lay abandoned because too many were gone to cultivate it. Others shifted to raiding as their main economic activity, creating cycles of destruction. The internal economy of Africa became distorted around the slave trade, making long-term development nearly impossible. Meanwhile, Europe thrived on Africa's losses. The gold, ivory, and spices once traded were replaced by human beings, the most profitable commodity of all. The trade created deep economic dependency. African leaders became reliant on European goods, while Europe grew wealthy and industrialized from the labor of Africans abroad. The imbalance set the stage for centuries of inequality between the continents. The demographic scars ran deeper still. The removal of millions slowed Africa's population growth for centuries, weakening its ability to defend itself from external threats. Communities were depopulated, villages abandoned, and entire regions scarred by repeated raids. Generations of children grew up without parents, and the traditional transmission of knowledge, skills, and culture was broken. Africa did not simply lose people, it lost the heartbeat of its future. Perhaps the most lasting wound of the slave trade in Africa was the cultural disruption it unleashed. Every enslaved person taken carried not only a body, but also a culture, a language, a history, a set of traditions. Their removal tore holes in Africa's cultural fabric. Oral traditions were cut short when storytellers were captured. Sacred rituals were lost when priests and elders disappeared. Songs, dances, and proverbs that should have been passed down for generations were silenced. Communities lived in fear, never knowing when raiders would come. Trust between neighboring peoples broke down. Villages fortified themselves or abandoned their lands entirely. This atmosphere of insecurity eroded cultural exchange and fostered suspicion. Once rich trade networks that had linked African societies were disrupted as regions became consumed by the hunt for captives. The slave trade also planted the seeds of colonialism. By weakening African kingdoms through violence and depopulation, Europe ensured that when the age of colonization arrived in the late 19th century, Africa was vulnerable. The very weapons and goods traded for captives created dependency, making African societies reliant on European imports. The trade had already taught Europe how to manipulate African politics, exploit divisions, and dominate through economic coercion. Colonization was not a new exploitation, but a continuation of patterns established by the slave trade. Yet, amid this devastation, Africa's resilience endured. Cultures adapted, blending old traditions with new realities. Some communities preserved fragments of memory, holding on to languages, rituals, and songs that would later be reborn in the African diaspora. Resistance existed, too. Villages fought against raiders. Rulers like Nzinga of Ndongo resisted European encroachment, and countless individuals sacrificed themselves to protect their people. The tragedy of Africa during the slave trade was not just in the millions taken, but in the worlds lost with them. Entire generations of stories, inventions, and possibilities vanished. The continent was left weakened, divided, and scarred, yet not broken. For out of this trauma, Africa would one day rise again, reclaiming its voice and confronting the legacy of its exploitation. For enslaved women, slavery carried a double burden. They endured the same brutal labor, whippings, and dehumanization as men, but they also bore the unique weight of gendered oppression. On plantations, women worked side by side with men in the fields, cutting sugar cane, harvesting cotton, or picking coffee. They rose before dawn, carried heavy loads, and endured the whip just as mercilessly. Yet after hours of labor, they were still expected to cook, clean, and care for children. In slavery, their roles as mothers and daughters were not protected, but weaponized. Motherhood under slavery was a paradox of love and terror. Enslaved women gave birth in shacks, often with no medical care, sometimes even in the fields. Infants were expected to return to work with their mothers strapped to their backs within days. But the greatest cruelty was the constant threat of separation. Slaveholders viewed enslaved children not as sons and daughters, but as future property. A mother might nurse her child only to see him sold away years later. Many mothers endured the unbearable pain of watching their children torn from their arms on the auction block, never to see them again. Women resisted in ways large and small. Some risked their lives to escape with their children, refusing to leave them behind. Others passed down lullabies, folktales, and naming traditions that preserved African identity, ensuring their children grew up with cultural roots even in bondage. Women also protected each other. Elder women in slave quarters often cared for children when mothers were sold or too exhausted to work. Sisterhood became survival. The enslaved woman's body was forced into labor for the master's wealth, but her spirit nurtured the seeds of freedom. By raising children with knowledge, faith, and quiet defiance, enslaved mothers preserved humanity in a system designed to erase it. Their resistance was not only an open rebellion, but in the fierce act of loving, protecting, and remembering their children despite unimaginable odds. Perhaps the most horrific and silenced aspect of slavery was the sexual violence inflicted upon enslaved women. From the earliest days of the trade, women were viewed not only as laborers, but as objects of exploitation. On slave ships, they were often singled out by captains and sailors, assaulted in the dark holds, or taken to officers' cabins. Many pregnancies aboard ships were the result of rape, and women carried both the trauma and stigma of these violations into the New World. On plantations, the violence continued. Enslaved women were subjected to the whims of their masters, overseers, and even other enslaved men acting under coercion. Rape was not only tolerated, but often encouraged as a tool of domination. It reinforced the master's power, destroyed family bonds, and ensured children born of these assaults would themselves become property, adding to the slaveholders' wealth. The law offered no protection. In the United States and across the Caribbean, rape of enslaved women was not considered crime. Their bodies were legally owned, and ownership meant access. This violence was systematic, not random. It was part of the politics of control. By making women vulnerable, slaveholders sought to crush resistance and assert dominance over every aspect of enslaved life. Women who resisted were punished brutally. Some were whipped publicly while pregnant. their stomachs dug into the ground to spare the unborn only so the master could protect his investment, not her dignity. And yet, even in this dark reality, women resisted. Some fought back physically, risking death to protect themselves. Others used cunning, feigning illness, hiding pregnancies, or creating networks of protection with other women. The trauma of sexual violence shaped generations, but it also produced leaders who would not be silenced. The courage of enslaved women lay not only in their survival, but in their refusal to let their dignity be erased. Their voices, though often erased from written history, speak through oral traditions, songs, and testimonies passed down through generations. Despite the crushing weight of slavery, enslaved women emerged as healers, cultural preservers, and leaders of resistance. They carried African traditions of herbal medicine, midwifery, and spiritual practices across the ocean, keeping communities alive in body and spirit. In slave quarters, women became midwives who delivered babies, healers who treated wounds with roots and herbs, and spiritual guides who preserved rituals and prayers that linked their people back to Africa. These roles gave women authority and respect within enslaved communities, even in the face of dehumanization. Women were also keepers of memory. Through songs, stories, and proverbs, they passed down fragments of African heritage, ensuring that cultural identity survived generations of oppression. Folktales like those of Anansi the Spider, an African trickster figure, became symbolic tales of resistance, teaching children how wit could defeat power. Women led dances and spiritual gatherings, blending African rhythms with Christian hymns, creating new cultural forms that carried both faith and defiance. Importantly, women were leaders in acts of resistance. In the Caribbean, Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica led guerrilla fighters against the British in the 18th century, earning legendary status as a warrior and strategist. In Suriname, women in Maroon communities fought alongside men in battles against Dutch colonists. In the United States, women like Harriet Tubman risked their lives guiding enslaved people to freedom on the Underground Railroad, armed with faith and a revolver. Tubman herself famously declared she never lost a passenger, becoming a symbol of black womanhood's power to liberate. Resistance also lived in everyday acts. Women sometimes slowed their work, broke tools, or sabotaged equipment. Others resisted by refusing to bear children, denying the system its future property. Still others found ways to secure education, teaching their children to read in secret, knowing that literacy was a weapon. Enslaved women, far from being passive victims, were pillars of resilience. They carried culture, healed the sick, raised the young, and led revolts. Their courage ensured that the African spirit survived across centuries of slavery. In them, resistance had a heartbeat, steady, unbroken, and defiant. For many enslaved Africans in the Americas, Christianity was both a tool of oppression and a weapon of liberation. Slaveholders used religion to justify bondage, twisting the Bible to claim that slavery was divinely ordained. Passages like "Servants, obey your masters" were preached from pulpits across the South and Caribbean, while entire portions of Scripture about freedom and justice were deliberately omitted when taught to the enslaved. Slave Bibles distributed in the colonies removed stories like the Exodus and any reference to liberation, leaving only lessons of obedience. But the enslaved were not passive recipients of this distorted religion. They reimagined Christianity on their own terms, transforming it into a faith of resistance. For them, the central story of the Bible was not obedience. It was Exodus, the tale of Moses leading the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. This narrative resonated deeply, becoming the spiritual framework for their own struggle. Spirituals like "Go Down," Moses were more than songs. They were prayers, codes, and cries for deliverance. In hidden gatherings known as hush harbors, enslaved people would meet in the woods, whispering prayers and singing hymns away from the ears of overseers. Christianity, reinterpreted, gave the enslaved hope that God was on their side. They believed in a God of justice, a deliverer who would hear their cries and break their chains. This reimagined faith offered more than comfort. It provided a language of defiance. It allowed them to see themselves not as passive victims, but as chosen people destined for freedom. Leaders like Nat Turner embodied this theology of resistance, believing himself called by God to strike down oppressors. Harriet Tubman, too, trusted in visions and dreams she interpreted as divine guidance, guiding her missions on the Underground Railroad. Christianity, in the hands of the enslaved, became a revolutionary faith. It was no longer the master's religion. It was the slave's declaration that bondage would not have the final word. Even as Christianity took root, African spiritual traditions remained powerful among the enslaved, carried across the Atlantic in memory, ritual, and song. Though colonizers dismissed them as superstition, these traditions preserved ancestral knowledge and gave enslaved Africans a vital connection to their homeland. They survived in new forms, blending with Christianity to create vibrant syncretic religions that continue to flourish today. In the Caribbean, Vodou in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and Obia in Jamaica drew from Yoruba, Fon, and Congo traditions. These systems honored spirits, ancestors, and deities known as Orishas or Loa, who acted as intermediaries between the divine and the human. Rituals often involved drumming, dance, possession, and offerings, practices that empowered participants with strength and solidarity. During slavery, such rituals were often held in secret, away from the eyes of masters who feared their power. And indeed, colonizers feared them for good reason. These religions provided not only spiritual comfort, but also networks of resistance. In Haiti, Vodou ceremonies, such as the famous Bois Cayman gathering in 1791, played a direct role in sparking the revolution that overthrew French rule. In Brazil, African traditions fused with Catholic saints to form candomblé. Worshippers outwardly appeared to honor Christian figures, but secretly invoked African gods. This blending of faiths was both survival and resistance, a way to preserve what masters tried to destroy. In the United States, African retentions survived more quietly in the Gullah Geechee communities of the South, where language, folk tales, and rootwork healing practices endured. These spiritual traditions were not merely religions. They were acts of cultural defiance. They preserved dignity in a world that sought to erase identity. They provided healing, community, and power to resist. Through drumming, chanting, and prayer, enslaved Africans reminded themselves that they were not broken, that their ancestors still walked with them, and that the spirits of Africa could never be chained. The fusion of Christianity and African spirituality gave birth to new religions that were deeply tied to the struggle for liberation. These faiths were not confined to churches or temples. They lived in songs, stories, and everyday acts of defiance. They were faiths of the oppressed, forged in fire, carrying both sorrow and hope. In the hush harbors of the American South, enslaved people created an invisible institution, a secret church where they could worship freely. Here, they prayed for deliverance, preached about justice, and shared coded messages of escape. These gatherings were dangerous. If discovered, participants could be whipped or worse, but they were also sacred. In those dark woods, faith became freedom. In the Caribbean and Latin America, syncretic religions like Vodou, Santeria, and Candomblé not only preserved African traditions, but also created communities of resistance. They became centers of rebellion, where leaders called upon the spirits to strengthen fighters, heal the wounded, and inspire courage. These religions offered something Christianity alone often could not: the assurance that ancestors were present, that African gods had crossed the ocean with them, and that spiritual power still belonged to the enslaved. This blending of traditions also reshaped global religion. Gospel music, born from African rhythms and Christian hymns, became a foundation for blues, jazz, and eventually rock and soul. The call and response patterns of African worship shaped the very style of preaching in black churches, turning sermons into dialogues of energy and empowerment. Spirituality gave rise to cultural revolutions that extended far beyond the plantation. Faith, in its many forms, was a shield and a sword. It gave enslaved people the strength to endure, the courage to resist, and a vision to believe in a better future. Religion was never just about heaven. It was about survival on earth, about reclaiming dignity in chains, and about declaring that no system of oppression could ever silence the spirit. Those slaveholders liked to portray enslaved people as passive. History tells another story, one of constant resistance and rebellion. Across the Caribbean and the Americas, enslaved men and women organized uprisings that shook empires, terrified masters, and inspired future generations. These rebellions were rarely successful in overthrowing slavery entirely, but they revealed the indomitable will for freedom and the courage to risk everything, even life itself, to strike against oppression. One of the earliest and most significant uprisings occurred in Jamaica in 1760, known as Tacky's Rebellion. Led by an enslaved African named Tacky, hundreds rose up, seizing plantations, killing overseers, and rallying fellow slaves. For weeks, the rebellion spread across the island until it was brutally suppressed by colonial militias and Maroons allied with the British. Though crushed, it revealed the deep unrest simmering beneath the sugar empire. In Demerara, modern Guyana, in 1823, another large revolt shook the colony. Inspired by rumors that Britain had granted freedom, but planters were withholding it, nearly 10,000 enslaved people rose in protest. The rebellion was nonviolent at first, with demands for liberty rather than bloodshed, but it was met with overwhelming brutality. British forces killed hundreds, and leaders were executed in public. The rebellion's failure did not erase its importance. It exposed the hypocrisy of colonial rulers and fueled abolitionist sentiment back in Britain. In the United States, slave revolts also left their mark. Gabriel Prosser's conspiracy, 1800, Denmark Vesey's planned uprising, 1822, and Nat Turner's rebellion, 1831, all revealed the determination of the enslaved to fight for freedom. Turner's revolt, in particular, spread terror across the South, as nearly 60 whites were killed before it was suppressed. The aftermath was horrific. Hundreds of innocent enslaved people were executed in revenge, but Turner's name became a lasting symbol of defiance. And of course, the most successful and transformative rebellion was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, where enslaved people not only fought but won, defeating Napoleon's armies and creating the first black republic in the world. Haiti stood as proof that revolution was possible, a beacon of hope for the enslaved and a nightmare for slaveholders everywhere. Not every act of resistance was a battlefield rebellion. For most enslaved people, survival itself was resistance, and daily acts of defiance chipped away at the system of slavery. These weapons of the weak may not have toppled empires overnight, but they sustained dignity, preserved culture, and undermined the absolute control slaveholders sought. Enslaved workers often resisted through sabotage. Tools were accidentally broken, plows damaged, or fires mysteriously started in barns and cane fields. Work was slowed deliberately, fields left partially unharvested, animals released or hidden. A sick day could be feigned, an injury exaggerated. These small acts allowed enslaved people to claim some control over their labor, even when their bodies were owned by another. Escape was another form of defiance. Thousands fled plantations, some temporarily to see family, others permanently to join marooned communities hidden in mountains and swamps. In the United States, the Underground Railroad became a symbol of such resistance, but escape networks existed across the Americas. Every runaway challenged the system, proving that no chain could fully bind the human spirit. Cultural preservation was itself a rebellion. Singing songs in African rhythms, telling ancestral folk tales, or speaking Creole languages was an act of defiance against cultural erasure. Even hairstyles carried coded meanings. Cornrows, for example, were sometimes braided in patterns that mapped escape routes or signaled secret messages. Food traditions, dances, and rituals all carried defiance, declaring, "We will not be erased." Religion, too, became a form of resistance. Secret gatherings in hush harbors, voodoo ceremonies in Haiti, or obeah rituals in Jamaica nurtured courage and solidarity. These spaces allowed the enslaved to reimagine themselves as more than slaves. They were a people connected to ancestors and destined for freedom. Such acts may have seemed small to outside observers, but together they built a culture of resistance that no whip could destroy. They reminded the enslaved that slavery was not natural, that could be defied in ways both loud and silent, violent and subtle. For slaveholders and colonial rulers, the greatest fear was not economic loss, but rebellion. The Haitian Revolution haunted them like a specter, a constant reminder that enslaved people could and would rise in arms if pushed too far. Across the Americas, whispers of another Haiti spread panic among the planter class. Every rumor of an uprising, every unexplained fire, every hushed song was seen as a threat. The paranoia was constant. To suppress this fear, slaveholding societies created elaborate systems of surveillance and violence. Slave patrols roamed the countryside in the American South, empowered to stop, search, and whip any enslaved person found off the plantation without a pass. Curfews were enforced. In the Caribbean, colonial authorities banned drumming and large gatherings, fearing they were cover for rebellion. Even literacy was restricted, since reading and writing could spread revolutionary ideas. The law itself was shaped by fear, designed to crush even the possibility of collective action. Yet fear could not erase reality. Rebellions continued to break out. Each time, they were put down with brutality. Executions, mutilations, and terror meant to deter future uprisings. But repression often had the opposite effect. It revealed the masters' weakness, their constant anxiety, their recognition that slavery was not secure. Globally, the fear of revolt influenced politics. In the United States, Southern leaders pushed for harsher laws and greater expansion of slavery, hoping to strengthen their hold. In Cuba and Brazil, authorities clung to slavery even longer, convinced that only chains could keep society stable. European empires tightened their grip on colonies, even as abolitionist movements at home gained ground. What slaveholders could not admit was this: their fear was justified. For the enslaved, rebellion was not an aberration. It was a natural response to oppression. Every revolt, every escape, Every whisper of resistance proved that slavery was a system sustained only by violence and destined to be broken. The fear of black revolt was the shadow of slavery's own death sentence. Even in the darkest days of slavery, black voices rose to challenge the system, not with weapons alone, but with words, intellect, and testimony. Among the most powerful were those of the African diaspora who experienced enslavement firsthand and then used their freedom to expose the horrors of the trade to the world. They were writers, preachers, and activists whose pens and speeches became weapons of liberation. Olaudah Equiano, also known as Gustavus Vassa, was one of the first and most influential. Kidnapped from what is now Nigeria as a child, Equiano survived the Middle Passage and years of enslavement before purchasing his freedom. In 1789, he published the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano, which became one of the earliest and most widely read slave narratives. His detailed account of the Middle Passage, the brutality of slavery, and his eventual freedom shocked European audiences, humanizing the enslaved in ways no statistics could. Equiano's testimony was a direct challenge to the dehumanizing lies used to justify slavery. Alongside him stood Ottobah Cugoano, another African captured and enslaved before gaining freedom in Britain. His 1787 work, Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil of Slavery, was a searing indictment of the system. Unlike Equiano, who often appealed to Christian morality and in America, Cugoano demanded immediate abolition and enslaved an African girl in Boston who became the first published black poet. His uncompromising voice made him a radical figure in the abolitionist movement. Her poems, infused with both Christian piety and subtle critiques of slavery, amazed white audiences and offered a vision of dignity and humanity. Later, David Walker would issue his appeal to the colored citizens of the world, 1829, a fiery pamphlet urging enslaved people to resist slavery by any means necessary, even force. Together, these early black intellectuals carved out a new space in history. They were not voiceless victims. They were witnesses, thinkers, and prophets. They spoke across oceans, demanding that the world recognize the humanity of Africans and the evil of bondage. Their words planted seeds of change, inspiring abolitionists and terrifying slaveholders. If Equiano and Cugoano gave voice to the beginnings of abolition, Frederick Douglass became its towering figure in 19th century America. Born enslaved in Maryland in 1818, Douglass endured the whip, the hunger, and the humiliation of bondage. But he also seized something forbidden: literacy. Secretly taught by a white woman before being forced to stop, Douglass continued to educate himself in secret, devouring newspapers, books, and scraps of writing until he forged himself into a master of words. At the age of 20, Douglass escaped slavery, disguising himself as a sailor and traveling north to freedom. Once free, he wasted no time in joining the abolitionist movement. His speeches electrified audiences in the United States and Britain. With his towering presence, eloquence, and fiery logic, he dismantled pro-slavery arguments one by one. Audiences often doubted he had truly been enslaved. So great was his command of language. In 1845, Douglass published his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. The book revealed the brutality of slavery in stark detail, describing beatings, the tearing apart of families, and his own struggle for dignity. It was a sensation, selling thousands of copies and forcing Americans and Europeans alike to confront the cruelty hidden behind the rhetoric of liberty. Douglass's narrative, like Equiano's before him, proved the power of testimony. But Douglass was not only a storyteller, he was a political force. He founded newspapers met with presidents, and argued passionately for not only abolition, but also full equality for African Americans and women. He believed in the power of education, insisting that knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. During the Civil War, he pressed Lincoln to allow black men to serve in the Union Army, arguing that fighting for the nation was also fighting for their own freedom. Douglas's life embodied the transformation from slavery to statesmanship. He was proof that the enslaved were not property, but people of immense intellect and ability. His voice carried the cries of millions, turning personal pain into collective power. Beyond individual figures, the rise of education and print culture became one of the most powerful tools in the fight against slavery. Slaveholders feared literacy for a reason. A literate slave could read abolitionist tracts, write passes for escape, or question the lies used to justify their bondage. Thus, laws in the American South forbade enslaved people from learning to read or write, with harsh punishments for both teacher and student. Yet despite this, many risked everything to gain knowledge. Secret schools, often hidden in barns, cabins, or woods, sprang up in slave communities. Children learned letters by tracing them in the dirt. Trusted elders taught by candlelight, passing on what little they knew. Every word learned was a small victory, every sentence a step toward freedom. For those who could not read, oral culture, songs, sermons, and stories carried knowledge, often with coded messages of escape or resistance. The growth of black print culture in the 19th century was revolutionary. Formerly enslaved people like Douglas, William Wells Brown, and Sojourner Truth published narratives, essays, and speeches that reached global audiences. These works humanized the enslaved, dismantled pro-slavery propaganda, and rallied abolitionist movements across continents. Newspapers like the North Star, founded by Douglas, and later the Colored American, gave black communities their own voices in print. Education was not only about literacy, it was about dignity. To learn was to assert humanity. To write was to claim history. To publish was to fight back against centuries of silence. After emancipation, freed people built schools at incredible speed, often pooling their meager resources to hire teachers. Churches doubled as classrooms. Within a generation, literacy rates among African Americans soared, a testament to the hunger for knowledge that slavery had tried to extinguish. This pursuit of education and print culture was a revolution in itself. It empowered leaders, created networks of resistance, and laid the intellectual foundation for future movements. It was proof that freedom was not only about breaking chains, it was about reclaiming the mind, the word, and the right to speak one's truth. The year 1807 marked a turning point in the long history of the transatlantic slave trade. After decades of relentless campaigning by abolitionists, the British Parliament passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal to traffic enslaved Africans within the empire. It was not the end of slavery itself. That would come later, but it was a monumental step. For the nation that had once dominated the slave trade, profiting from its ships, ports, and colonies, this law was both a moral awakening and a political calculation. The abolitionist movement in Britain had been building since the late 18th century. Figures like William Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, and Thomas Clarkson led parliamentary campaigns, while ordinary citizens, especially women, boycotted slave-grown sugar and signed petitions in the tens of thousands. Testimonies from formerly enslaved Africans, such as Olaudah Equiano and Atoba Kugoano, shook public opinion, while engravings of slave ships, such as the infamous diagram of the Brooks with Africans packed tightly into its hold, exposed the horror in stark, undeniable imagery. But moral outrage alone did not pass the law. Britain's changing economy also played a role. By the early 19th century, industrialization was reshaping wealth, making slavery less central to British profits than in earlier centuries. At the same time, constant slave rebellions in the Caribbean, culminating in the Haitian Revolution, had shown how unstable and dangerous slavery had become. The fear of another Haiti haunted planters and politicians alike. Ending the trade was seen not only as moral, but as a way to stabilize empire. Still, the 1807 Act was historic. It gave the Royal Navy the authority to intercept slave ships, seize their human cargo, and prosecute traders. British patrols began scouring the Atlantic, capturing ships flying Portuguese, Spanish, and later, even American flags. Abolitionists celebrated, believing a new age of justice had begun. Yet the reality was more complicated. The trade did not end, it went underground. Smugglers, pirates, and illegal traders continued to operate, and millions more Africans would still be shipped across the Atlantic in the decades after 1807. Britain's law was a breakthrough, but it was also a reminder. Laws on paper are only as strong as the will to enforce them. While Britain was making strides against the trade, the United States faced its own contradictions. The U.S. Constitution, written in 1787, had already compromised with slavery to hold the fragile Union together. It allowed the importation of enslaved Africans to continue for 20 years, despite growing pressure from some quarters to end it immediately. In 1808, as the deadline arrived, Congress officially banned the importation of enslaved Africans. On paper, America had joined Britain in ending the trade, but in practice, the U.S. commitment was shallow. The law was poorly enforced, and illegal smuggling continued for decades. Ships still landed on southern shores, bringing human cargo in secret. The infamous Clotilda, one of the last known slave ships, smuggled Africans into Alabama as late as 1860, over 50 years after the ban. Even more hypocritical was the fact that while importing new slaves was prohibited, the domestic slave trade flourished. Within the United States, enslaved people were sold from the Upper South to the booming cotton plantations of the Deep South in what became known as the Second Middle Passage. Families were ripped apart in massive forced migrations, with more than 1 million enslaved people relocated between 1808 and 1865. The contradiction was glaring. America claimed to have ended its participation in international trade, yet built an even more powerful system of internal trafficking. Slave markets in cities like Richmond, New Orleans, and Charleston became some of the largest in the world, selling men, women, and children like livestock. The wealth generated from this internal trade fueled the cotton boom that made the United States a global economic power. Meanwhile, African Americans, both enslaved and free, pointed out the hypocrisy. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth denounced the false morality of a nation that preached liberty while practicing bondage. The U.S. ban on the trade was a symbolic step, but without dismantling slavery itself, it was little more than window dressing. The law revealed America's deep unwillingness to confront the root of its injustice. The abolition of the slave trade by Britain, 1807, the U.S., 1808, and eventually other nations did not immediately end the trafficking of Africans. Instead, the trade shifted into the shadows, becoming an illegal but still highly profitable enterprise. Smugglers, pirates, and rogue traders continued to capture and transport Africans well into the mid-19th century. For many enslaved people, the nightmare of the Middle Passage did not vanish with laws. It simply changed its disguise. Ships often sailed under false flags, claiming neutral nations as their origin. Slavers used faster vessels to evade British patrols, and captains grew more ruthless. To avoid capture, some threw enslaved Africans overboard to destroy evidence. The Atlantic waters, already filled with the bones of millions, continued to swallow new victims. Estimates suggest that at least 2 million Africans were trafficked illegally after 1807, many ending up in Brazil and Cuba, where slavery remained central to the economy. Enforcement was inconsistent. Britain's West Africa Squadron, a naval fleet tasked with policing the trade, captured hundreds of ships and freed thousands of Africans. But the ocean was vast, and slavers always found new routes and methods. The United States, despite its ban, largely turned a blind eye, especially in the South where slavery remained profitable and politically defended. Yet resistance also continued. Africans captured for the trade sometimes revolted at sea, taking over ships despite desperate odds. One of the most famous cases was the Amistad Revolt of 1839, when Africans seized control of the Spanish schooner La Amistad. After a long legal battle, they were recognized as free men by the U.S. Supreme Court and returned to Africa, a rare but powerful victory. Similar uprisings occurred on other ships, though most ended in tragedy. By the mid-19th century, international treaties, naval patrols, and shifting economies finally strangled the illegal trade. But the damage was done. Generations have been stolen, entire societies disrupted, and millions left in graves at sea or in foreign lands. The so-called abolition of the trade had been a slow, uneven, and deeply compromised process, driven as much by politics and economics as by morality. And yet, the resistance of the enslaved, the pressure of abolitionists, and the gradual collapse of the trade signaled a truth. Slavery's time was running out. The chains that had bound millions for centuries were beginning to break, though not without leaving scars that would last forever. When slavery was legally abolished across the Americas, the struggle to end bondage was not followed by an honest reckoning. Instead, societies often chose silence, distortion, or outright denial. Slaveholders and their descendants rewrote history to downplay the cruelty of slavery, portraying it as a necessary evil or even a civilizing mission. In the United States, the myth of the happy slave became widespread, promoted through literature, children's books, and even academic writing. Plantations were romanticized as places of charm and hospitality, with slavery treated as a benign institution rather than a system built on brutality. In the Caribbean and Brazil, similar silences emerged. Colonial elites wanted to erase the memory of resistance, portraying emancipation as a gift from benevolent rulers rather than the result of relentless struggle by the enslaved themselves. The Haitian Revolution, one of the most important events in world history, was deliberately minimized or demonized. France punished Haiti with crushing reparations, and other nations refused to recognize its independence for decades, fearful that its example would inspire further revolts. This suppression of memory was not accidental. It was political. Remembering slavery truthfully meant acknowledging the crimes of empires, the wealth built on stolen lives, and the debts owed to the descendants of the enslaved. By silencing or distorting memory, elites protected their power and avoided accountability. But not all memory was lost. Within black communities, slavery was remembered through oral traditions, family stories, and cultural practices. Elders recounted the pain of bondage and the triumphs of resistance. Songs, proverbs, and rituals carried fragments of the past across generations. While official histories ignored or erased the enslaved, communities preserved their truth in ways the oppressors could never control. The tension between remembering and silencing remains central to slavery's legacy. History books often erase the voices of the enslaved, but memory endured in families, churches, and folklore, quietly resisting the world's attempt to forget. In societies where reading and writing were denied to the enslaved, memory survived through the spoken word. Oral traditions became a lifeline, a way of passing down history, wisdom, and resistance. Through storytelling, song, and proverb, enslaved Africans preserved fragments of their heritage and gave their children the tools to endure oppression. Folktales played a special role. Trickster stories, such as those of Anansi the spider, carried from West Africa to the Caribbean, taught lessons about survival and wit. Anansi, small but clever, outwitted stronger opponents, an allegory for enslaved people resisting mighty masters. These stories, told around fires or whispered in cabins, gave children hope and a sense of continuity with Africa. Songs were equally vital. Spirituals in the United States, work songs in the Caribbean, and chants in Brazil all carried double meanings. On the surface, they seemed like expressions of faith or rhythm for labor, but beneath, they often held coded messages. Songs like Follow the Drinking Gourd guided runaways toward the North Star. Others signaled rebellion or escape plans. Music preserved African rhythms and call and response patterns, embedding memory in sound. Oral traditions also preserved memory of specific events. Stories of revolts, such as the Haitian Revolution or Maroon victories, were passed down to inspire new generations. Even in silence, memories of ancestors endured. Mothers told children the names of grandparents taken away. Elders recalled life in Africa before capture. Griots, oral historians, maintained fragments of genealogies. Folklore was more than entertainment. It was survival. It allowed enslaved people to claim an identity beyond bondage, to see themselves not as property, but as heirs of a long, proud history. Oral tradition defied erasure, ensuring that even when official histories ignored them, the enslaved remained remembered. This memory also influenced global culture. African rhythms shaped blues, jazz, and gospel in the U.S., calypso, reggae, and samba in the Caribbean and Brazil. Proverbs, tales, and spirituals crossed oceans, embedding the memory of slavery into the DNA of modern music and storytelling. Even today, echoes of oral traditions remind us that the enslaved left not only scars, but also legacies of creativity and resilience. Why does it matter to remember slavery? Some argue that it belongs in the past, that reopening wounds only deepens division. But forgetting slavery is itself an injustice, for silence denies the suffering of millions and obscures the roots of inequalities that persist today. Remembering slavery is not about dwelling on pain. It is about confronting truth and understanding the world we live in. The legacies of slavery are visible everywhere. Racial inequality, systemic discrimination, and economic disparities across the Americas are not accidents. They are the direct descendants of slavery. The wealth of Europe and North America was built on stolen labor, while African and Caribbean nations were left impoverished by centuries of exploitation. To ignore this is to ignore the foundation of modern global inequality. Remembering also honors resistance. The story of slavery is not only one of suffering, but of courage, of rebellions, escapes, cultural survival, and the unbreakable will for freedom. By remembering, we restore agency to those whom history tried to silence. We recognize Harriet Tubman guiding her people to freedom, Nanny of the Maroons leading warriors in Jamaica, Toussaint Louverture shaping Haiti's revolution, and countless unnamed men and women who resisted in everyday acts. Furthermore, memory serves as a warning. Slavery was once justified by law, religion, and science, systems that claimed authority but were twisted to defend exploitation. Remembering reveals how easily injustice can be normalized when societies choose profit over humanity. It teaches us vigilance, reminding us to challenge modern forms of slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, systemic racism that continue to plague the world. Finally, memory creates healing. For descendants of the enslaved, remembering is an act of reclaiming identity, dignity, and history stolen by oppression. It opens the possibility for justice, whether through education, reparations, or honest dialogue. For the world as a whole, remembering slavery forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, but also to envision a more equal future. To forget slavery would be to betray those who suffered and those who resisted. To remember, it is to honor them and to carry forward the lessons they gave at unimaginable cost. When slavery officially ended in the United States in 1865, it did not mean true equality had arrived. The abolition of chains was only the beginning of a new form of oppression, segregation, and systemic racism. For millions of newly freed African Americans, emancipation brought joy and hope, but it also brought betrayal, as white supremacy quickly adapted to preserve power. During Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, there was a brief period of progress. The 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting rights to black men, and formerly enslaved people entered politics in significant numbers. Leaders like Hiram Revels and Blanche Kay Bruce were elected to the U.S. Senate, and hundreds of African Americans served in state legislatures. Schools for freedmen were established, literacy rates soared, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed that America might rebuild itself on the foundation of equality. But this progress provoked a violent backlash. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black communities with lynchings, arson, and intimidation. By the late 19th century, the federal government abandoned Reconstruction, and the South implemented Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation. Separate schools, hospitals, trains, and neighborhoods were imposed, always inferior for black citizens. Voting rights were stripped through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright violence. The afterlife of slavery was clear. While legal bondage ended, systemic oppression continued. Black labor was exploited through sharecropping, which trapped families in cycles of debt and dependency eerily similar to slavery. The justice system criminalized black existence through vagrancy laws, feeding a system of convict leasing where African Americans were arrested for minor offenses and forced into unpaid labor for industries and plantations. The ideology of slavery, that black people were inferior, remained alive in science, education, and culture. Racist theories like social Darwinism justified inequality, while minstrel shows caricatured black identity to entertain white audiences. The promise of freedom was undermined by the reality of segregation, proving that abolition alone could not erase centuries of racism. Thus, America entered the 20th century with slavery's shadow intact. Chains had been broken, but the cage of racism still confined millions in the Caribbean and Latin America. Emancipation unfolded differently, but the results were strikingly similar. Freedom without real power. When slavery ended in islands like Jamaica, Cuba, and colonies across the region, formerly enslaved people were left without land, compensation, or political representation. They were free in law, but not in life. Plantation economies continued to dominate, and freedmen were often forced back to the very fields they had once worked under slavery. With little access to land, many became wage laborers or sharecroppers under contracts that mirrored bondage. The sugar and coffee industries still relied on black labor, but wealth flowed outward to white elites and European markets. Freedom was hollow without economic independence. In places like Cuba, abolished 1886, and Brazil, abolished 1888, slavery ended so late that the racial hierarchy was deeply entrenched. Elites resisted integrating freed populations into society. Black people faced exclusion from education, employment, and politics, trapped in cycles of poverty that persisted across generations. In many islands, colonial powers maintained control, ensuring that even after slavery, colonialism continued. Racism also persisted in subtler but powerful ways. In Brazil, for example, the ideology of whitening encouraged European immigration and promoted intermarriage in hopes of diluting African heritage. In the Caribbean, cultural traditions rooted in Africa were often stigmatized, with practices like voodoo, obeah, and santeria persecuted as superstition or witchcraft. And yet, resistance endured. Freed communities preserved their culture through festivals, music, and religion. Movements for independence and labor rights gained strength, often led by descendants of the enslaved. The Caribbean became a hotbed of intellectual resistance in the 20th century, producing thinkers like Marcus Garvey, who envisioned global black unity, and writers like Césaire and Frantz Fanon, who challenged colonialism and racism with powerful words. But the truth remained. Emancipation in the Caribbean and Latin America was freedom stripped of land, wealth, and power. Without reparations or structural change, slavery's legacy remained embedded in poverty, inequality, and systemic discrimination. While the Americas grappled with slavery's afterlife, Africa faced a different but equally devastating fate: the transition from slave trade to colonial rule. The centuries of depopulation and destabilization caused by the Transatlantic Slave Trade left many African societies weakened, fragmented, and vulnerable. Just as the trade was waning in the 19th century, European empires turned to a new form of domination: colonialism. The scramble for Africa in the late 1800s carved the continent into European possessions. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 85, European powers divided African lands with no regard for ethnic, cultural, or historical boundaries. The very kingdoms that had once resisted slave raids now found themselves conquered by armies armed with modern weapons and backed by industrial economies. Colonialism was, in many ways, slavery reborn, this time not through the export of African bodies, but through the exploitation of African lands and labor. Colonial rulers imposed forced labor systems, demanding Africans work on plantations, in mines, or building railways. Taxes were introduced that could only be paid through wage labor, forcing people into dependency. Traditional governance structures were undermined or co-opted, with chiefs turned into instruments of colonial rule. Education, when provided, was limited and designed to create subservient workers rather than independent leaders. The ideology of slavery, that Africa was backward and inferior, was repackaged as the civilizing mission. Europeans claimed they were bringing progress, Christianity, and modernity, but in truth, they were continuing the centuries-old exploitation of African people and resources. The scars of the slave trade made colonial conquest easier, as depopulation and inter-ethnic conflicts weakened resistance. Yet Africa did not submit quietly. Resistance erupted across the continent, from the Maji Maji Rebellion in German East Africa to the wars of Samori Touré in West Africa. These struggles often drew upon memories of resistance during the slave trade, showing a continuity of defiance. But colonialism, like slavery before it, reshaped Africa for generations, ensuring that even after the slave ships stopped sailing, exploitation continued under new flags. The transition from slavery to colonialism revealed a grim truth. For Africa, the end of one system of domination was the beginning of another. The continent had endured the theft of its people, only to face the theft of its lands. Slavery's shadow had crossed the ocean, but it also remained firmly rooted in Africa itself. Even after the abolition of slavery, justice was never delivered. Enslaved people received no compensation for centuries of stolen labor, broken families, and shattered lives. Instead, it was often the former slaveholders who were paid reparations. In Britain, planters received millions of pounds from the government after 1833 as compensation for the loss of their property. In contrast, the freed were left with nothing. No land, no resources, no protection from poverty. Haiti, after fighting for its freedom, was forced by France in 1825 to pay an indemnity of 150 million francs, a debt so crushing that it crippled the nation's economy for more than a century. This grotesque injustice showed that even in freedom, the enslaved remained bound by financial chains. The demand for reparations has never disappeared. Across the Caribbean, Africa, and the wider diaspora, activists and scholars argue that the wealth of Europe and North America was built on slavery, and thus justice requires repayment. The Caribbean community, CARICOM, has formally demanded reparations from former colonial powers, calling for debt relief, education programs, and development funds as redress for centuries of exploitation. In the United States, movements like H.R. 40 have sought to study reparations for African Americans, linking the wealth gap today directly to slavery's legacy. Memory plays a crucial role in this demand. Monuments, museums, and memorials have begun to rise across the world, from Ghana's Door of No Return to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. These spaces preserve the truth, confronting societies with the horrors they once tried to forget. Yet in many places, memory is still contested. Statues of slave traders, colonial governors, and Confederate generals stand as reminders of a history sanitized by those who benefited. Removing them or recontextualizing them has become part of the struggle for justice. Reparations are not only financial, they are moral. They mean restoring dignity to those whose humanity was denied. They mean admitting that slavery was not just an unfortunate past, but a crime against humanity with consequences still visible today. The demand for justice is not about vengeance. It is about healing. And until reparations, in whatever form, are addressed, the shadow of slavery will remain unhealed. Point one of slavery's paradoxes is that while it sought to erase African identity, it instead gave birth to one of the richest cultural legacies in the modern world. Across the Americas, the descendants of the enslaved created new languages, religions, music, and art that not only preserved fragments of Africa, but transformed global culture forever. This is the power of the African diaspora, the ability to survive, adapt, and create beauty out of suffering. Music is perhaps the clearest example. From the spirituals of the American South came blues, gospel, jazz, and eventually rock, hip-hop, and R&B. In the Caribbean, African drumming and rhythms birthed calypso, reggae, salsa, and soca. In Brazil, samba carried the heartbeat of Africa, while capoeira blended martial arts with dance as a hidden form of resistance. These cultural forms, once mocked or suppressed, are now celebrated worldwide, shaping the soundtracks of entire nations. Language, too, reflects resilience. Creole tongues developed in the Caribbean and Louisiana, blending African, European, and indigenous words into new languages that carried identity across generations. Food traditions, okra, rice, yams, black-eyed peas, became staples of global cuisine, testimony to the enslaved who planted seeds, both literal and cultural, in foreign soil. The diaspora also preserved spiritual strength. Vodou in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, Candomblé in Brazil, and the Black Church in the United States became spaces where history, faith, and resistance merged. These institutions gave people identity in a world that sought to erase them. Perhaps most importantly, the diaspora forged a political voice. Leaders like Marcus Garvey, W.E.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, and Malcolm X linked the struggles of black people globally, turning the memory of slavery into fuel for anti-colonial and civil rights movements. From Harlem to Kingston to Accra, the call for black unity became a force that reshaped nations. The African diaspora is proof of survival. It shows that slavery, though it inflicted unimaginable suffering, could not destroy identity. Out of bondage came creativity, resilience, and a cultural legacy that now enriches the world. The diaspora turned pain into power, and in doing so, kept the memory of ancestors alive. The Transatlantic Slave Trade was one of humanity's darkest chapters, but is also a story of resilience, of courage, and of survival. The enslaved were never voiceless, never powerless. They resisted, remembered, and rebuilt. Their legacy lives in every song, every story, every struggle for justice. To tell their story is not only history, it is responsibility. And to carry their lessons forward is the only true way to honor their memory. Today, we have walked together through centuries of pain, courage, and resilience. We saw how kingdoms fell and empires rose on the backs of the enslaved. We heard the cries of families torn apart, the whispers of resistance in hush harbors, the roar of rebellions in Haiti and Jamaica, and the voices of abolitionists who demanded justice. We learned that slavery did not end with chains broken. It left a long shadow of racism, segregation, and inequality that still touches our lives today. But we also discovered the strength of the human spirit, the survival of culture, and the unstoppable dream of freedom. That is the true legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. If this story moved you, remember, it is only one chapter in the vast ocean of history that shapes our present. On History Teller YT, we will continue to bring you stories that open your eyes, stir your heart, and remind you that the past is never really past. Subscribe, stay with us, and join us next time as we uncover more hidden truths of our shared history. Because to remember is to honor, and to learn is to ensure that such darkness never rises again. Asterisk